The plaza's neon signs flickered against the wet pavement, casting long, shivering shadows across Ayla's face. Behind her, the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots. Marcus. Ayla, don't make me chase you. His voice hissed through the crowd, a sound that made her skin crawl. Her eyes scanned the upscale square, landing on a figure who seemed to anchor the very air around him. Seo Kyungho. He sat on the edge of a marble fountain, his posture relaxed, but his presence absolute, a king carved from ice and ink. Driven by a desperation that tasted like copper, Ayla didn't just run to him. She crossed the invisible line. She reached out, her fingers brushing the dark, intricate ink of the tattoo creeping up his neck, and pressed her lips to his. Kyungho's body turned to stone. His guards, shadows and tailored wool, shifted instantly, their hands disappearing into their jackets. The world went silent. Then, the stone thawed. A heavy, warm hand slammed against the small of Ayla's back, pulling her flush against him with terrifying finality. He didn't pull away. He took the kiss and made it a conquest. You chose a dangerous shield, Zinhle. Kyungho whispered against her mouth, his voice a low, melodic threat. Now you have to live with it. Ayla Zinhle had spent years trying to be small. She had just made herself the most visible woman in the city. The transition from the rain-slicked plaza to the hushed interior of the black SUV was seamless, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of Kyungho's world. Inside, the air smelled of sandalwood and expensive leather, a sharp contrast to the metallic scent of fear that had trailed Ayla all evening. Kyungho sat beside her, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the city lights blurring past the window. He hadn't touched her since the moment they left the fountain, yet his presence was a physical weight against her skin. You're trembling, he noted. It wasn't a question, nor was it particularly sympathetic. It was a cold observation of a fact. I didn't think he'd find me there, Ayla whispered, her fingers knotting together in her lap. Kyungho turned his head slightly, the light from a passing street lamp illuminating the jagged edges of the dragon tattoo on his neck. He won't find you again. But understand this, Ayla, you didn't just escape a man tonight. You stepped out of the shadows and into a spotlight. To the streets, you are no longer a face in the crowd. You are mine. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow as the vehicle pulled into the private, subterranean garage of a glass and steel monolith. This wasn't a temporary hiding spot, it was a transition. As they ascended in the private elevator, the digital floor counter climbing rapidly toward the clouds, Ayla caught her reflection in the polished chrome. Her soft waves were disheveled, her eyes wide and hauntingly bright. She looked like a girl who had made a deal with a god to escape a devil, only to realize the god expected his tithe. The elevator doors slid open directly into a sprawling penthouse that redefined the concept of a golden cage. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, making Los Angeles look like a collection of glittering jewels spread out for their amusement. This is your home now, Kyungho said, stepping into the center of the room and shedding his tailored coat. His movements were fluid and predatory, the relaxed posture of a man who knew no one would dare challenge him in his own sanctum. My men are at the doors. My eyes are on the street. You wanted safety, Ayla. Here it is. Ayla walked toward the glass, looking down at the tiny, distant headlights of the world she used to inhabit. Somewhere down there was her small apartment, her shift at the gallery, and the constant, suffocating dread of Marcus's shadow. That life was gone. She was safe, but as she looked at Kyungho, dangerous, untouchable, and undeniably magnetic, she realized the price. She was no longer Ayla Zinhle, the woman who was hiding. She was the woman who had been claimed. The sanctuary of the penthouse felt less like a home and more like an airless museum as the first week bled into the next. Ayla spent her hours watching the city pulse below, a world she was now forbidden to touch without an escort of stone-faced men. The silence of the apartment was broken only by the occasional chime of her phone, a device she had been terrified to look at until Kyungho's head of security, a man named Minho, took it from her. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling glass, tracing the path of a helicopter when the heavy double doors of the study groaned open. Kyungho stepped out, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink that mapped his forearms. In his hand, he held her phone. "He is persistent," Kyungho said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that made the hair on Ayla's neck stand up. He didn't hand the device back. Instead, he turned the screen toward her. The notifications were a visceral assault. 50 missed calls. 32 messages. The most recent one from Marcus flashed on the screen. "I know whose car you got into, Ayla. You think a suit and a tattoo can keep me away? I'm coming to get what's mine." Ayla felt the familiar, icy grip of panic tightening around her throat. The vulnerable elegance she tried so hard to maintain fractured, her breath hitching as she looked at Kyungho. "He's not going to stop. He's followed me across 3 zip codes before. He thinks he owns me." Kyungho walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the silk rug. He stopped just inches away, radiating a heat that felt both protective and predatory. "Ownership is a heavy word, Ayla. One he doesn't understand the weight of." He tapped a button on her phone, and a video feed appeared. It was a grainy, high-angle shot of a dim alleyway behind the gallery where Ayla used to work. Marcus was there, looking frantic, his face distorted by a jagged, obsessive rage. He was shouting at a man in a dark suit, one of Kyungho's men. "Watch," Kyungho commanded softly. In the video, Marcus swung a fist. He didn't even connect. Within seconds, 2 more shadows emerged from the darkness. They didn't use guns. They used a terrifying, clinical efficiency. They moved like a single machine, folding Marcus to the pavement with a precision that made Ayla's stomach turn. They didn't kill him. They broke him, quietly, methodically, and without a hint of emotion. "I don't kill nuisances unless they become threats," Kyungho whispered, leaning down so his lips brushed the shell of her ear. "I simply show them the cost of looking at things that don't belong to them. He is currently on a bus to the border. If he steps back into this city, he won't be walking. Do you understand?" Ayla looked from the frozen image of her defeated tormentor to the man standing over her. The fear of Marcus was being replaced by a different, more complex dread. She had asked for a shield, and she had been given a fortress made of bone and iron. "You're scaring me," she admitted, her voice barely a threat. Kyungho's hand reached out, his thumb grazing her jawline, lingering on the pulse point that was drumming wildly against his skin. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and utterly possessive. "Good," he murmured. "Fear keeps you alert. But remember this, Ayla, you only ever have to fear what is outside these walls. Inside, you are the only thing I have ever chosen to keep." He dropped her phone into a glass of water on the side table, the screen flickering once before going dark forever. The old Ayla was submerged with it. The woman standing in the penthouse was someone new, someone whose safety was now a matter of Mafia law. The warning had been delivered, not just to Marcus, but to her. She was no longer prey, but she was very much a prize. The transition from the cold, sterile heights of the penthouse to the humid, neon-drenched streets of Koreatown felt like descending into a different dimension. Ayla sat in the back of the darkened sedan, her silk slip dress shimmering like oil on water every time the car passed beneath a street lamp. Beside her, Kyungho was a study in monochromatic shadow. He didn't speak, but the occasional brush of his shoulder against hers sent a low-voltage hum through her veins that she couldn't quite name. "Stay close," he directed as the car pulled up to a nondescript steel door tucked away in a graffiti-marred alley. There was no sign, no velvet rope. Only 2 men who stood like monoliths in the dark. At the sight of Kyungho, they didn't just step aside. They bowed, a synchronized, deep gesture of reverence that made Ayla's heart skip. Inside, the club was a fever dream of deep violets and burning ambers. The music wasn't loud, but it was heavy, a rhythmic thrum that vibrated in the floorboards. As they moved through the lounge, the atmosphere shifted. It was as if a wave of silence preceded Kyungho, a physical ripple that stilled glasses midair and turned heads toward the floor. It wasn't the loud, rowdy fear Marcus inspired. It was a profound, terrifying respect. Powerful men in sharp suits stood up as he passed, and beautiful women lowered their gazes, acknowledging the apex predator in the room. Kyungho led her to a private booth overlooking the dance floor, his hand settling naturally on the small of her back. The touch was possessive, a silent signal to everyone watching that she was under his seal. A server appeared instantly, placing a bottle of vintage whiskey and a single crystal glass of sparkling water for Ayla without a word being exchanged. "They look at you like you're a ghost," Ayla whispered, leaning closer to him to be heard over the bass. Kyungho poured a drink, his movements precise. "In this city, ghosts are the only ones who survive. People respect what they cannot predict, Ayla." He turned his head, his dark eyes catching the neon violet light, making the ink on his neck seem to writhe. "Tonight, you aren't a victim hiding in a penthouse. You are the guest of the Seo Syndicate. Look at them. None of them can touch you. None of them would dare." Ayla followed his gaze. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of being the hunted lifted. She watched the elite of the underworld navigate the room, all of them orbiting the man sitting next to her. She looked at his hands, capable of the clinical violence she had seen on the monitor, yet currently resting with such stillness on the table. An unfamiliar heat began to override her fear. It was a dangerous, forbidden pull toward the very thing that should have repelled her. She wasn't just attracted to his power. She was attracted to the way he used that power to carve out a space where she could finally breathe. She looked at his sharp jawline, the calm intensity of his expression, and the way he seemed to dominate the space without uttering a single threat. "You like it," Kyungho murmured, his eyes finding hers. It wasn't a question. He had tracked the change in her pulse, the way she had stopped shrinking and started leaning into the luxury of his protection. "I like feeling safe," she countered, though her voice lacked its usual tremor. "Safety is a luxury I provide," he said, his fingers reaching out to trail slowly over the back of her hand. "But don't mistake the cage for the world, Zinhle. You're beginning to see the shadows. Be careful not to fall in love with them." Ayla didn't look away. The fear was still there, but it was being swallowed by a hunger to know the man behind the tattoo, even if it meant stepping further into the dark. The return to the penthouse felt different after the neon-soaked adrenaline of the club. The air was thinner, the silence more intimate. Ayla stood by the vast windows of the living area, watching the city lights flicker like dying embers, while the reflection of Kyungho moved behind her. He had discarded his tie and unbuttoned his collar, the movement revealing more of the black ink that stained the column of his throat. "You've been staring at it all night," Kyungho said, his voice cutting through the stillness. He wasn't looking at her, but at the glass of amber liquid in his hand. "The mark." Ayla turned, her silk dress rustling. "It's hard not to. It looks like it's protecting you, or holding you together." Kyungho gestured to the sofa, a silent invitation. When she sat, he didn't loom over her. He sat close enough that she could feel the radiating heat of his body, yet he kept a deliberate inch of space between them. He tilted his head, exposing the full breadth of the tattoo, a dragon's tail that coiled around his jugular, disappearing beneath his shirt toward his heart. "In my world, you don't get a choice about who you become," he began, his eyes fixed on some distant point in his memory. "I wasn't born into the Seo Syndicate. I was the son of a woman who cleaned their floors. When the previous boss decided to expand, he used the sons of the workers as foot soldiers, disposable pawns." He traced the edge of the ink with a blunt fingernail. "This wasn't a fashion statement. It was a brand. At 19, I was sent to handle a debt that shouldn't have been mine. I failed, and they didn't just beat me, they tried to erase me. The scars underneath this ink are jagged and ugly. They were meant to remind me of my place." Ayla reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch from his skin. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. "So you covered them," she whispered. "I reclaimed them," he corrected, finally turning his gaze to hers. "I took the syndicate from the man who branded me. Every needle stroke of this dragon was a choice to be the monster instead of the victim. The ink is the armor. The beast is what keeps the world at bay." He took her hand, his palm rough and warm, and guided her fingers to the base of his neck. Underneath the smooth, expensive texture of the tattoo, Ayla could feel the raised, uneven ridges of the scars he had described. It was the physical map of a man who had clawed his way out of hell. "You see elegance, Ayla, because I pay for it to be here," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly confession. "But underneath, I am still that boy in the dirt, willing to do anything to survive. That is the man you kissed in the plaza. That is the man who claims you now." The vulnerability of the moment was sharper than any threat. Ayla didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she let her fingertips trace the history of his pain, realizing that they were more alike than she had imagined. They were both survivors of different kinds of violence. He had simply chosen to wear his as a weapon. "We both have marks, Kyungho," she said softly, looking into his dark, searching eyes. "Yours are just easier to see." For the first time, the predatory mask he wore slipped, replaced by a look of profound, silent recognition. The forbidden attraction she had felt at the club solidified into something deeper, a dangerous understanding that tethered her soul to his. In the quiet of the penthouse, the monster and the girl found a shared language in the scars. The transition from the sanctuary of the penthouse to the outside world always felt like a plunge into freezing water, but today the air felt particularly thin. They were moving through the industrial outskirts of the city, a three-car motorcade cutting through the gray morning fog. Ayla sat in the armored middle SUV, her hand resting instinctively near Kyungho's on the leather seat. The intimacy of the previous night, the shared scars and whispered histories, still hummed between them, softening the hard edges of his usual silence. The violence didn't start with a shout. It started with a concussive roar. A heavy delivery truck veered sharply from an intersection, T-boning the lead vehicle with a screech of twisting metal. Before Ayla could even scream, the world dissolved into chaos. The window beside her head spiderwebbed as a high-caliber round slammed into the reinforced glass. "Get down." Kyungho's voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar of command. He didn't just tell her to hide. He became her shield. In one fluid, violent motion, he lunged across the seat, his massive frame pinning her to the floorboards. The rhythm of the world was replaced by the deafening, erratic staccato of automatic gunfire peppering the chassis. Ayla was pressed into the carpet, the scent of his sandalwood cologne masked by the acrid sting of gunpowder and the ozone of the car's electrical systems failing. Through the gap between the seats, she saw the calm, clinical mask of the Mafia boss shatter. For the first time, she saw the cracks in the armor. Kyungho's jaw was set so tight it looked ready to snap, and his eyes weren't filled with his usual icy detachment. They were wide with a frantic, raw desperation. He wasn't fighting for a syndicate or a territory. He was fighting to keep his body between the bullets and the woman beneath him. A stray round punched through the door's interior casing, sending a spray of plastic shards across Kyungho's shoulder. He didn't flinch, but a sharp hiss of pain escaped his teeth, and Ayla saw a bloom of crimson begin to stain the white linen of his shirt, right over the wing of his dragon tattoo. "Kyungho, you're hit," she gasped, her voice lost in the thunder of the counterattack as his men spilled out of the other cars to return fire. "Don't look," he wheezed, his weight heavy and protective over her. "Stay small, Zinhle. Just stay small." In that moment, the power dynamic shifted in a way she never expected. The man who commanded gravity, the man who moved through the city like an untouchable god, was bleeding for her. The vulnerability in his strained breathing and the way his hand trembled as he reached for his own weapon revealed the truth. She wasn't just a prize he had claimed. She was a weakness he couldn't afford, yet one he was willing to die to protect. As the screech of tires signaled the arrival of reinforcements and the rival shooters began to retreat into the fog, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Kyungho didn't move immediately. He stayed draped over her, his forehead resting against hers, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He looked at her not as a boss, but as a man who had almost lost the only thing that made him feel human. The shield had cracked, and through the fissure, Ayla saw the terrifying depth of a love that was as dangerous as the men who had just tried to kill them. The aftermath of the attack left the penthouse feeling less like a fortress and more like a target. The scent of antiseptic and heavy silence clung to the rooms as Kyungho recovered, his movements stiff, his focus sharpened to a lethal edge. Ayla paced the length of the glass walls, her mind replaying the sight of his blood on her hands, until the chime of a burner phone, left on the kitchen island by an unknown hand, shattered the quiet. The voice on the other end wasn't the frantic, unhinged Marcus she remembered. He sounded emboldened, his malice polished by a new, dangerous confidence. "You thought your little boyfriend was the top of the food chain, Ayla? You should see the company I'm keeping now. The CO syndicate is a dying star, and I'm with the people who are going to snuff it out." He wasn't just stalking her anymore. He was a pawn for a rival faction, a loose cannon being aimed directly at Kyungho's heart. Before she could process the threat, the phone buzzed with a message containing a location and a time. "Be there, or watch him burn." Panic, cold and suffocating, seized her. She attempted to find Kyungho, but as she reached the hallway, the heavy front doors opened. It wasn't the syndicate guards who stepped inside, but two men in plain suits with the unmistakable, weary posture of federal agents. They didn't arrest her. They cornered her in the library, the late afternoon sun casting long bars of shadow across the floor. "We know who you are, Ms. Zinhle. And we know who Seo Kyungho is," the older agent said, sliding a folder across the mahogany table. Inside were surveillance photos of the warehouse, the motorcade attack, and Kyungho's ink-stained silhouette. "He's a ghost we've been chasing for a decade. And right now, he's vulnerable." They offered her a way out, a clean slate, a new identity, and a life where no one named Marcus or Kyungho could ever find her. The price was simple: the encryption keys to Kyungho's private servers, currently hidden in his study. "He's a criminal, Ayla," the agent leaned in, his voice a mimicry of kindness. "He didn't save you. He kidnapped you into a war. Marcus has aligned himself with the Triad rivals. They're going to hit this building. If you stay, you die with him. If you help us, we take them all down, and you walk away free." The weight of the ultimatum pressed against her chest like a physical hand. On one side was the right choice, the law, the safety of the shadows she had once craved, and an end to the violence. On the other side was the man who had bled for her, the man whose scars she had touched, and whose territorial claim had been the only thing that made her feel alive in years. She looked at the folder, then toward the closed door of Kyungho's office where he sat, wounded and plotting her protection. The agents were right. He was a villain. He was a monster who had claimed her without asking. But as she felt the ring he had placed on her finger, she realized Marcus and the police wanted the same thing: to control her. "I need time," she whispered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "You have until midnight," the agent replied, leaving a card on the table. "After that, the shield breaks. Make sure you're on the right side of the debris." Ayla stood alone in the center of the room, caught between the ghost of her past and the predator of her present, realizing that the way out might be the most dangerous gamble of all. The midnight deadline approached like a rising tide, the air in the penthouse growing thick with the scent of rain and impending violence. Ayla stood in the center of the dimly lit library, the federal agent's card lying on the mahogany table like a poisonous snake. In her hand, she held the small silver drive containing the encryption keys she had retrieved from Kyungho's study while he was in a strategy meeting with Minho. It was her ticket to a quiet life, a world of witness protection and suburban safety where the name Marcus was a ghost and Kyungho was a headline she'd never have to read. She looked at the silver drive, then toward the master bedroom, where Kyungho's bloodstained shirt from the motorcade attack still sat in the laundry hamper, a reminder of the man who had turned his body into a wall of flesh and bone to keep her alive. The heavy doors opened, and Kyungho stepped in. He looked weary, the bandage beneath his black silk shirt pulling at the skin of his neck, yet he still carried that untouchable, dangerous grace. He stopped when he saw her standing by the table, his eyes immediately dropping to the drive in her hand. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call his guards. He simply leaned against the doorframe, his dark gaze unreadable. "The agents were here," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "I know they offered you a way out. I know they want the keys. Ayla's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. They said if I stay, I'll die in the crossfire. They said you're a ghost and a criminal. Kyungho took a step toward her, the light catching the sharp angle of his jaw and the dark coil of the dragon on his throat. They're right. I am a ghost. I am a man who has done terrible things to keep this empire standing. And the crossfire is coming, Ayla. Marcus and the triads won't wait for morning. He stopped an inch away from her, the familiar heat of him radiating through her silk dress. If you want to go, the back elevator is clear. Minho will drive you to the precinct himself. I won't stop you. Ayla looked up at him, searching for the monster the agents had described. She saw instead the boy who had been branded, the man who had reclaimed his scars, and the protector who had claimed her in a public plaza when she had nowhere else to turn. She realized then that the agents didn't want to save her. They wanted to use her to dismantle the only thing that made her feel safe. Without a word, Ayla walked to the fireplace. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the silver drive into the heart of the embers. She watched as the plastic bubbled and the metal warped, the secrets of the Seo syndicate turning into smoke. Then, she picked up the federal agent's card and dropped it in after the drive, watching the white paper curl into black ash. She turned back to Kyungho, her vulnerable elegance hardening into something steel-ribbed and absolute. She was no longer a victim seeking a shield. She was a partner choosing her side. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice steady for the first time in years. If we're going to burn, we burn together. Kyungho's expression fractured, a look of raw, possessive wonder breaking through his mask. He reached out, his large hand cupping the back of her head, his thumb tracing the line of her ear. He pulled her flush against him, his lips pressing a hard, territorial seal against her forehead. Then let them come, he whispered against her skin. I'll show them what happens when they try to touch what belongs to the dragon. The bridge was gone. The world of the law was behind her. Ayla Zinhle had stepped fully into the neon shadows, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The grand crystal ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold, designed to project an image of absolute legitimacy. For the first time, Kyungho moved through the crowd not as a shadow, but as a titan of industry, his dark suit impeccable, his hand never leaving Ayla's waist. Ayla was breathtaking in a gown of midnight silk that mirrored the ink on Kyungho's neck, her vulnerable elegance, now sharpened into a regal, dangerous poise. They were the center of the room, the dragon and his queen, yet beneath the tinkling of champagne flutes, the air tasted of ozone and impending lightning. The ambush didn't happen in the dark. It happened under the blinding heat of the chandeliers. As the keynote began, a series of muffled thuds echoed from the kitchen, not gunfire, but smoke canisters. Within seconds, the ballroom was a chaotic swirl of white haze and screaming socialites. Kyungho's hand tightened on Ayla, pulling her back toward the service exit, but the path was blocked. From the mist emerged Marcus, his face a distorted mask of scars and desperation, flanked by 4 men whose tactical gear bore the insignias of the rival triad. Did you think a few broken bones would stop me? Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking with a manic, hollow bravado. He didn't look at Kyungho. His eyes were fixed on Ayla with a terrifying, singular obsession. The triad gunmen raised their weapons, but Kyungho's security was already engaging. The room erupted into a deafening staccato of crossfire. Kyungho spun Ayla behind a marble pillar, his own weapon drawn, his face returning to that state of deadly calm. But as a rival shooter rounded the corner, Kyungho was forced to step out to return fire, leaving Ayla momentarily exposed. Marcus saw his opening. He lunged through the smoke, a serrated blade glinting in his hand. If I can't have you, no one will. Ayla didn't scream. She didn't shrink. She remembered the warehouse, the utilitarian violence she had witnessed, and the way Kyungho moved, not with anger, but with precision. As Marcus swung, she stepped into his guard rather than away from it, using his own momentum against him. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it with a sharp, clinical snap she had practiced in the penthouse gym with Minho, and drove her heel into his knee. As Marcus buckled, Ayla didn't hesitate. She reached into the concealed slit of her gown and drew the small, weighted tactical pin Kyungho had given her, a tool for survival. With a steady hand, she drove it into the pressure point at the base of Marcus's neck, just as she had seen the dragon do to his enemies. Marcus collapsed, gasping, the predator finally reduced to a heap of broken nerves at her feet. Kyungho appeared from the smoke, his shirt torn, blood splattered across his cheek, but his eyes were blazing with a dark, primal pride. He looked at Marcus on the floor, then at Ayla, who stood tall, her chest heaving, her eyes as cold as the marble pillars. "I told you," Kyungho murmured, stepping over the fallen man to take her face in his hands. "You were never meant to be the prey." The gala was a ruin, the legitimate facade shattered, but as the sirens wailed in the distance, Ayla realized she didn't need the facade anymore. She had used the monster's tactics to save herself, and in doing so, she had finally truly claimed her place beside him. The ambush was over, but the rain had just begun. The transition from the scorched ruins of the grand crystal ballroom to the serene, dawn-lit terrace of the penthouse felt like emerging from a fever. Below, the city was waking up, its arteries of light and concrete unaware of the shift in the underworld's tectonic plates. Marcus was no longer a shadow in an alley or a voice on a burner phone. He was a memory, permanently neutralized by the very machine he had tried to dismantle. The rival triads had retreated into the fog, their leadership decimated, leaving a vacuum that Kyungho had no intention of filling with more blood. Ayla stood at the railing, her midnight silk gown replaced by a soft cashmere robe, her hands steady as she poured 2 cups of tea. The vulnerable elegance that had once been her armor was gone, replaced by a quiet, immovable strength. She didn't flinch when Kyungho stepped onto the terrace, his shoulders still bandaged, his movements regaining their lethal grace. "The board of directors for the new holding company met an hour ago," Kyungho said, leaning his hip against the stone balustrade. He looked at her not with the possessive gaze of a master, but with the profound respect of a partner. "The transition is complete. The Seo name is now attached to logistics, international trade, and luxury hospitality. The old ways are being buried with the debris of the gala." Ayla smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "And the utilitarian violence, reserved for those who forget that a dragon is still a dragon, even in a tailored suit," he replied, though his tone was lighter than she had ever heard it. He reached out, his hands settling on her waist, not to claim her, but to ground them both. "You saved yourself tonight, Ayla. You didn't just survive Marcus. You survived the version of yourself that was afraid of him." She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. The fear that had defined her for years had been replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. They were no longer a story of a victim and a villain. They were the architects of a new empire, one built on the wreckage of their pasts. "We aren't hiding anymore," she whispered, looking out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed gold over the skyline. "No," Kyungho agreed, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw before tilting her face up to his. "We are the ones the others hide from now." The public kiss in the plaza had been a desperate gamble, a plea for a shield. But as Kyungho pressed his lips to hers in the quiet light of the morning, Ayla realized she hadn't just found a protector. She had found her equal. Together, they stood at the edge of a new world, 2 survivors who had turned their scars into a crown. The transformation was total. The girl who had mastered invisibility had become the woman who commanded the light, and beside her, the dragon finally found peace in the power they shared. Their reign hadn't just begun, it was already legendary. If you love the story, hit that like button, leave a comment with your favorite parts, and subscribe to Mafia Secret Love Stories so you don't miss out on our next story.